I watched in disbelief as the tow truck sank deeper into my front lawn, its rear wheels spinning helplessly against the mud. The driver's face had gone pale. 20 neighbors stood in shocked silence along the sidewalk, their morning routines forgotten as they witnessed the spectacle unfolding on my property. In the center of it all stood Karen, her designer shoes now ruined by the 6 inches of mud she was standing in, her face contorted with a rage I had never seen before. Her once pristine SUV sat at an impossible angle, front end submerged in what appeared to be an ordinary suburban lawn. "You planned this," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You are going to pay for every cent of damage." I remained calm on my porch, coffee cup in hand, watching 3 months of calculated patience finally pay off. The folder of evidence sat ready on the table beside me. She had parked on my lawn for the last time. "Actually, Karen," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "this is exactly what happens when you park on someone else's property after they have asked you not to. Every single day." I always took pride in my home. After saving for 7 years while living in a cramped apartment, I had finally purchased this modest 3-bedroom house in Oak Ridge Estates. It was not the biggest property in the neighborhood, but it was mine. Every weekend I dedicated hours to maintaining my lawn, carefully selecting the right fertilizers, removing weeds by hand rather than using chemicals, and watering precisely during the optimal morning hours. The deep green grass was my small achievement, something I could look at each day with satisfaction. The trouble began 3 months after I moved in. I was preparing for work one Tuesday morning when I heard the distinctive sound of tires rolling across grass. Through my kitchen window, I spotted a large white SUV parking partially on my front lawn. The vehicle belonged to a woman I had only seen at a distance during the monthly HOA meetings. She lived 3 houses down, always dressed immaculately, her blonde hair cut in what my mother would call the speak-to-the-manager style. I stepped outside, still holding my coffee mug. The morning air felt cool against my face as I approached her. She was retrieving what appeared to be presentation boards from her backseat. "Excuse me," I said with a polite smile. "I would appreciate it if you could park on the street or driveway instead of my lawn. I have been working hard to keep it in good condition." The woman turned, eyeing me with a look that suggested I had said something utterly ridiculous. Her eyes narrowed slightly before her lips formed a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "The street parking is completely full because of the construction down the block," she replied, gesturing vaguely toward the end of the street. "And this spot is perfectly flat. I will only be a minute while I drop these materials off for the community center renovation committee." Before I could respond, she had gathered her boards and was walking briskly toward the house across the street. I noticed the HOA logo prominently displayed on one of the boards. Deciding not to push the issue for a one-time occurrence, I returned inside to finish preparing for work. The next day, I was startled to find the same SUV parked in exactly the same spot on my lawn. This time I was running late for an important meeting and could only watch from my window as she exited her vehicle and walked to the same house. By the 3rd consecutive day, deep tire tracks had begun to form in my once pristine grass, the weight of the vehicle compressing the soil and creating unsightly ruts. I prepared a note and placed it under her windshield wiper. "Please refrain from parking on my lawn. The grass is being damaged. Thank you for your understanding." I signed it with my name and house number, keeping the tone professional and courteous. That evening I found the note crumpled in my mailbox. No response, no acknowledgement, just the returned note balled up as if it were trash. The 4th morning I decided to wait. When she arrived and began parking, I stepped out immediately. "I left a note yesterday," I said, maintaining my composure. "Your vehicle is causing damage to my lawn. I would really appreciate it if you would park elsewhere." The woman sighed dramatically, as if I were causing her great inconvenience. "I am Barbara Winters, chairperson of the HOA Architectural Review Board," she stated, emphasizing her title. "I have important community business to attend to, and the Jenkins family has graciously allowed me to use their home for meetings during the community center renovation. The parking situation is temporary, and quite frankly, it is just a small patch of grass." "It is my property," I replied firmly, "and there is street parking available just 20 feet further down." Barbara's expression hardened. "Young man, I have lived in this community for 15 years. A little flexibility from new residents goes a long way toward building good relationships here." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving her vehicle exactly where it was. I stood there, feeling a growing sense of frustration as I surveyed the deepening cracks in my lawn. This was not just about grass anymore. This was about respect for property and boundaries. That weekend, I documented the damage with my camera, taking close-up photographs of the tire impressions, the muddy ruts, and the dying grass. Little did I know that these first pictures would become the beginning of an extensive evidence file that would eventually turn the tables on Barbara Winters, the woman everyone in the neighborhood had apparently taken to calling HOA Karen behind her back. My approach to conflict has always been methodical and by the book. Rather than escalating the situation immediately, I decided to pursue proper channels. The HOA had established procedures for resident complaints, and I intended to follow them precisely. I downloaded the official complaint form from the community website, attached my time-stamped photographs, and included a detailed account of my verbal requests for Barbara to stop parking on my property. 3 days after submitting my complaint, I received a brief email response from the HOA office. "Thank you for your submission. The board will review your concern at the next scheduled meeting in 2 weeks." Meanwhile, Barbara's SUV continued its daily occupation of my lawn, the damage worsening with each visit. I began recording arrival and departure times, adding this information to my growing documentation. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived. I entered the community center meeting room with my folder of evidence tucked under my arm, prepared to present my case calmly and factually. The room was already half full, with about 20 residents seated in rows facing a long table where board members sat. Barbara occupied the center position, a nameplate identifying her as Barbara Winters, Vice President. When resident concerns were opened for discussion, I approached the podium and explained my situation. I had rehearsed to ensure I maintained a professional tone. "Thank you for hearing my concern," I began. "For the past 3 weeks, Ms. Winters has been parking her vehicle on my front lawn despite multiple requests to stop. This has caused significant damage to my grass and soil. I have documentation of the damage and my attempts to resolve this directly." Before I could continue, the HOA president, a tall man with silver hair named Robert Blackwell, interrupted me. "Ms. Winters has already brought this matter to my attention," he stated flatly. "She explained that due to the ongoing community center parking lot renovation, temporary parking accommodations are necessary for board members conducting official business." Barbara nodded, adding, "We have all had to make sacrifices during this renovation period. The community's needs must sometimes take priority over minor personal inconveniences." "This is not a minor inconvenience," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is damage to private property that will require costly repairs." Robert glanced at Barbara briefly before responding. "The board recognizes your concern, but must balance individual issues against community needs. The renovation will be completed in approximately 6 more weeks, at which point normal parking will resume. We thank you for your patience during this transition. And just like that, my complaint was dismissed. No investigation, no compromise offered, not even an acknowledgement of the property damage. I left the meeting stunned by the casual dismissal of what seemed to me a straightforward issue of property rights. The following weekend, I visited the county records office and obtained certified copies of my property survey, clearly showing that the area where Barbara was parking fell well within my property boundaries. I also researched local ordinances regarding trespassing and property damage. Armed with this additional information, I submitted a second, more detailed complaint to the HOA. This time, the response came in the form of an official letter, stating that, after careful consideration, the board has determined that temporary parking arrangements during the renovation period fall under the emergency powers provision of the HOA Covenant, Section 14.3. The letter concluded by reminding all residents of the community spirit that made Oak Ridge Estates special. My frustration mounting, I decided to speak with other neighbors. That Saturday, I knocked on the door of Tom Henderson, whose property adjoined mine. Tom invited me in, and as we sat in his kitchen, he shared his own experience with Barbara. Last year, I installed a small garden fountain without getting prior approval, Tom explained. Within days, I was receiving daily violation notices for unapproved water feature and potential mosquito breeding ground. The fine started at $50 per day. I fought it for 2 weeks before giving up and removing it. The next month, Barbara installed an almost identical fountain in her own backyard. Tom's story confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The HOA board, or at least Barbara's portion of it, operated on favoritism and intimidation rather than fair enforcement of community standards. Traditional methods of resolution were failing me, and my lawn continued to suffer under the daily weight of Barbara's SUV. With conventional methods exhausted, I turned to research. If I could not stop Barbara through official channels, perhaps there were other legal ways to protect my property. I spent evenings after work reading about property law, landscaping techniques, and water management systems. My dining room table disappeared under books and printouts as I searched for a solution that would be both effective and legally defensible. During this intensive research period, I discovered that while HOAs hold significant power over aesthetic changes to property, they cannot override basic property rights or local ordinances regarding trespassing. More importantly, I learned that homeowners generally have considerable leeway in how they manage the natural elements of their property, particularly water drainage and landscaping designed to prevent erosion. I reached out to Marcus Johnson, a former college classmate who now owned a landscaping business in a neighboring county. After explaining my situation in detail, I asked if he would be willing to meet for a professional consultation. Marcus agreed, and we arranged to meet that weekend. The morning of our appointment, Marcus arrived in his company truck, equipped with soil testing equipment and landscaping reference materials. He spent nearly an hour examining my lawn, taking soil samples, and making notes on a clipboard. Barbara's SUV had already come and gone, leaving fresh tire marks for Marcus to evaluate. "The damage is significant," Marcus concluded, pointing to the compacted soil and the tire tracks. "Repeated compression like this destroys the root systems and prevents proper drainage. But there might be an opportunity here, given what you are trying to accomplish." We moved to my kitchen table, where Marcus began sketching a modified drainage plan for my front lawn. "Most suburban lawns have a standard drainage pattern," he explained, drawing arrows to indicate water flow. What you could do, entirely within your rights as a homeowner, is modify this section to create what we call a retention area. It would look completely normal and comply with all regulations, but would have very different structural properties. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. By adjusting the subsurface composition and creating specific zones with moisture-retaining materials, I could establish areas that remained solid under foot traffic but would yield under the concentrated weight of a vehicle. The surface would appear completely normal, lush green grass covering what appeared to be solid ground. The key is using hydrophilic soil compounds, Marcus continued, showing me product specifications from his reference materials. These materials absorb and hold water, creating a soft substrate beneath the visible grass layer. They are completely natural and environmentally safe, often used in erosion control and sustainable landscaping. I studied the diagrams carefully, and this would be compliant with HOA regulations. Absolutely, Marcus confirmed. You would be implementing proper drainage solutions for your specific soil conditions, using approved materials that are standard in modern landscaping. Nothing in your plan would violate aesthetic guidelines, as the surface appearance would remain consistent with neighborhood standards. Over the next week, I thoroughly reviewed the HOA covenant document, paying particular attention to landscaping regulations. As Marcus had suggested, while there were strict rules about visible features, there were no restrictions on subsurface drainage solutions or soil composition. In fact, the covenant actually encouraged proper water management systems to prevent erosion and property damage. Armed with this knowledge, I developed a comprehensive plan. I ordered the specialized soil compounds Marcus had recommended, along with other necessary materials. I also purchased a discreet outdoor camera system that could be installed to monitor my front lawn continuously, necessary both for documentation and security. The timing would be critical. I learned through community newsletters that the HOA was planning their quarterly board member dinner at Barbara's house the following weekend. This would be the perfect opportunity to implement my modifications, ensuring they would be properly settled before being tested. As I gathered supplies and refined my strategy, I consulted briefly with a legal advisor to ensure my plan could not result in liability issues. The attorney confirmed that modifying my own property for improved drainage was well within my rights, especially given the documented damage caused by unauthorized parking. He advised me to maintain detailed records of all modifications and to ensure that any changes were genuinely designed for proper water management, which they were, even if they would have additional consequences for unwanted vehicles. The pieces were falling into place. My research had revealed a solution that was legal, environmentally sound, and potentially very effective. For the first time since this conflict began, I felt a sense of control returning. Barbara had used her position to ignore my rights and reasonable requests. Now, the natural properties of soil and water might succeed where human systems of conflict resolution had failed. The Saturday of the scheduled HOA board dinner arrived with perfect weather conditions for my project, overcast but not raining, with high humidity that would help settle the new soil components. I rose before dawn, eager to complete the work with minimal observation from neighbors. The supplies I had ordered throughout the week were neatly organized in my garage. Specialized soil compounds, drainage materials, new sod sections, and landscaping tools. I began by carefully removing the damaged sections of grass, setting aside the sod to be reused where possible. Working methodically, I excavated targeted areas to a depth of approximately 8 inches, focusing on the precise spots where Barbara typically positioned her vehicle. The existing soil, compacted from weeks of bearing the SUV's weight, came up in dense clumps. In these excavated depressions, I installed a layered system. The bottom layer consisted of expanded clay aggregates that would provide structural support while allowing water movement. Above this, I added the specialized hydrophilic compounds mixed with standard topsoil. These materials had remarkable properties. When dry, they formed a stable surface nearly indistinguishable from regular soil, but when saturated, they transformed into a soft, yielding substrate. Throughout the installation, I was careful to maintain a natural grade across my lawn. The modified areas needed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding landscape, with no visible indications of the changes beneath. I measured and remeasured the depth and width of each area, ensuring that the trap would be triggered only by the specific pressure pattern of vehicle tires. By mid-afternoon, I had replaced the sod over the modified sections, carefully watering the new installations to help them settle and bond with the existing lawn. To the casual observer, my front yard now looked better than it had in weeks, the damaged areas refreshed with lush new grass that concealed the engineered system beneath. As I was completing the final touches, my neighbor Tom walked by, pausing at the edge of my property. "Fixing up the damage from our HOA queen?" he asked, nodding toward the fresh sod. "Just doing some necessary lawn maintenance," I replied with a casual smile. The drainage in this section needed improvement. Tom glanced toward Barbara's house further down the street, where preparations for the evening's HOA board dinner were visibly underway. "Well, it looks great. Much better than those tire tracks." I thanked him and continued with my work, carefully removing all evidence of the installation. By evening, my lawn appeared completely normal, perhaps even more attractive than before, with no indication of the substantial modifications hidden beneath the surface. The final phase of preparation involved setting up my new camera system. I installed 2 discrete cameras with motion activation features, one positioned to capture my entire front lawn, and another focused specifically on the area where Barbara typically parked. Both cameras were properly angled to avoid capturing any neighboring properties, ensuring compliance with privacy regulations. Inside my home, I connected the cameras to a recording system and verified that they were functioning properly. The video quality was excellent, providing clear documentation of anyone or anything that might interact with my property. As darkness fell, I performed one last check of my modifications. Walking across the lawn, I could detect no difference between the modified areas and the regular turf. The surface felt solid and stable underfoot. However, I knew that the physics involved were quite different. The specialized soil compounds created a structure that would support distributed weight like a person walking, but would yield and sink under the concentrated pressure of a vehicle tire. That evening, I reviewed all my documentation one final time. My folder now contained dated photographs of Barbara's SUV, parked on my lawn over multiple weeks, copies of my formal complaints to the HOA and their dismissive responses, the property survey confirming my ownership of the affected area, detailed receipts and product information for all materials used in my lawn modifications, clearly showing their intended purpose for proper drainage and soil stability. Written notes from my consultation with Marcus, focusing on water management solutions. Confirmation from my legal advisor that property owners have the right to implement drainage solutions on their own land. I set my alarm for early the following morning. Barbara typically arrived between 7:15 and 7:30 am to park before her morning appointments. If my calculations were correct, tomorrow would bring a very different outcome to her usual routine. As I prepared for bed, I felt a curious mixture of nervousness and anticipation. My solution was non-destructive and fully legal. I had modified my own property using approved materials for legitimate drainage purposes. If Barbara chose to respect my property rights and park elsewhere, she would never encounter any issues. But if she continued her pattern of entitlement and trespassing, natural forces would demonstrate why boundaries should be respected. The specialized soil compounds were now set. The cameras were recording. All that remained was to wait for morning when Barbara would make her choice, though she would be unaware that, for the first time, there would be consequences for her decision. Morning arrived with perfect conditions for what was about to unfold. An overnight drizzle had saturated the ground, activating the hydrophilic compounds beneath my lawn's surface. I woke before my alarm, feeling a strange calm as I prepared coffee and positioned myself near the kitchen window with a clear view of my front yard. At precisely 7:22 a.m., Barbara's white SUV appeared at the end of the street. My heart rate increased slightly as I watched her approach, turning toward my property with the casual entitlement that had become her trademark. Without hesitation, she guided her vehicle onto my lawn, parking in exactly the same spot she had claimed as her own for weeks. For a moment, everything appeared normal. Barbara gathered her purse and a leather portfolio from the passenger seat, apparently preparing to exit the vehicle. That was when physics began its inexorable work. The front tires, bearing the engine's weight, started to sink into what had appeared to be solid ground. The movement was gradual at first, almost imperceptible, but accelerated as the hydrophilic compounds responded to the concentrated pressure. Barbara noticed something was wrong when her vehicle tilted forward. She paused, confusion visible on her face even from my vantage point. She put the SUV in reverse and pressed the accelerator. The rear wheels spun on the still solid portion of the lawn, but instead of extracting the vehicle, they simply drove the front tires deeper into the soft substrate. Within seconds, her front wheels had sunk nearly 6 inches into my lawn. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching as Barbara exited her vehicle, her expression transitioning from confusion to disbelief. She circled the SUV, examining the front tires now partially submerged in what appeared to be ordinary grass. When she stepped near the affected area, her designer heels immediately sank into the soft ground. She pulled her foot free, now coated with mud, and her face contorted with growing anger. This was my cue. I stepped outside onto my front porch, coffee mug still in hand, and observed the scene with calm interest. Barbara spotted me immediately. "What have you done to your lawn?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at her stranded vehicle. "Good morning, Barbara," I replied evenly. "I have improved the drainage system on my property. The recent soil compression from unauthorized parking created water retention issues that needed addressing." "This is deliberate sabotage," she shouted, her voice echoing down the quiet morning street. "You have deliberately trapped my car. I am calling the police." "Feel free to do so," I responded, maintaining my composure. "I have complete documentation of the damage caused by your daily parking on my property, copies of my formal requests for you to stop, and detailed records of the standard drainage improvements I have implemented. All materials used are environmentally approved and commonly used in modern landscaping." Barbara's face flushed red as she pulled out her phone and stabbed at the screen with manicured fingers. While she made her call, I noticed curtains moving in neighboring houses. The commotion had attracted attention, and several residents emerged onto their porches or front steps, observing the unusual scene unfolding on my lawn. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up alongside the curb. Officer Reynolds, a middle-aged man with a methodical demeanor, approached and surveyed the situation. "We received a call about a vehicle being deliberately trapped on private property," he stated, looking between Barbara and me. Barbara immediately launched into her version of events, her voice strained with indignation. "I temporarily parked on the edge of his lawn, as I have done before when visiting the Jenkins home for community business, and he has deliberately sabotaged his yard to damage my vehicle." Officer Reynolds turned to me. "Sir, can you explain what has happened here?" With calm precision, I recounted the weeks of unauthorized parking despite my repeated requests for Barbara to stop. I then explained the drainage improvements I had implemented to address the soil compression damage caused by her vehicle. "I have complete documentation," I added, retrieving my folder from inside the house, including dated photographs of Ms. Winters parking on my property, copies of my formal complaints to the HOA which were dismissed, and detailed information about the standard drainage materials I installed. Officer Reynolds reviewed the documents carefully while Barbara stood nearby, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The officer paid particular attention to the property survey and the photographs documenting the repeated trespassing. "Ms. Winters," he said finally, "based on the documentation provided, you have been regularly parking on private property despite the owner's requests to stop. That constitutes trespassing." "This is ridiculous," Barbara protested. "I am the vice president of the Homeowners Association. I have important community responsibilities." "Your position does not grant you the right to use private property without permission," Officer Reynolds stated firmly. "As for the vehicle situation, this appears to be an unfortunate coincidence. The homeowner has the right to improve drainage on his property, and there are no signs indicating deliberate sabotage." By this time, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching the scene with undisguised interest. Among them was Robert Blackwell, the HOA president, still in his bathrobe and looking decidedly uncomfortable as Officer Reynolds continued his assessment. "You will need to arrange for a tow service with proper equipment to extract your vehicle," the officer informed Barbara. "Standard tow trucks might struggle with these conditions." Barbara's composure finally shattered completely. "This is a deliberate attack by a disgruntled resident. The HOA will not stand for this kind of behavior." She turned toward me, finger pointed accusingly. "You will be receiving violation notices for improper lawn maintenance and creating a neighborhood disturbance." Officer Reynolds interjected before I could respond. "Ms. Winters, I strongly advise against making threats at this time. Based on the documentation I have reviewed, this resident has followed proper procedures in attempting to resolve this issue." As Barbara stormed off to make arrangements for specialized towing services, neighbors began to approach me, speaking in low voices about their own experiences with Barbara's selective enforcement of HOA rules. The morning's events had cracked the facade of intimidation that had kept the community silent for so long. The sweet taste of vindication was enhanced by the knowledge that I had achieved it through patience, documentation, and an understanding of natural principles, rather than through confrontation or violation of rules. Barbara's SUV remained prominently stuck in my specially engineered lawn, a monument to consequences that even HOA power could not override. The extraction of Barbara's SUV proved to be a spectacle that drew even more attention than its initial predicament. The standard tow truck she called arrived promptly, but quickly determined that specialized equipment would be necessary. The driver, Attempting to position his vehicle close enough for extraction, inadvertently placed his rear tires partially on another modified section of my lawn. Within moments, the tow truck itself was tilting at an awkward angle, its rear wheels sinking several inches into the yielding ground. "I have never seen anything like this," the tow operator admitted, scratching his head in bewilderment. "Looks perfectly normal but acts like a bog. You will need a specialized recovery service with extended cables and proper equipment." This additional complication drew even more neighbors from their homes. By mid-morning, nearly half the community had found reasons to walk past my property, observing the unusual scene with poorly concealed satisfaction. Barbara remained nearby, making increasingly agitated phone calls while shooting venomous glances in my direction. The specialized recovery service arrived 3 hours later. Using extended winch cables to avoid placing their own vehicle on my lawn, they successfully extracted first the tow truck and then Barbara's SUV. Both vehicles emerged with muddy wheels but no permanent damage. The recovery specialist examined my lawn with professional curiosity. "Interesting drainage system you have here," he commented. "Perfectly designed for water retention. Good environmental choice." By afternoon, news of the morning's events had spread throughout the community. Robert Blackwell, the HOA president, called an emergency board meeting for that evening at the partially renovated community center. The email notification cited urgent property maintenance concerns as the agenda. I arrived at the meeting precisely on time, my documentation folder under my arm. The room was surprisingly full, nearly 3 times the usual attendance for HOA meetings. Barbara sat at the board table, her expression rigid, her usual immaculate appearance somewhat diminished by the day's stress. Robert called the meeting to order with obvious discomfort. "We are here to address concerns about property modifications at 347 Oak Ridge Drive that resulted in vehicle extraction requirements this morning." Before he could continue, I raised my hand. When acknowledged, I stood and addressed the board and assembled residents. "I believe it is important to establish the full context of this situation," I began, opening my documentation folder. Using the meeting room's projector, I displayed the chronological photographs of Barbara's SUV parked on my lawn over multiple weeks, the visible damage progression, copies of my formal complaints, and the dismissive responses I had received. After exhausting all official channels for resolution, I explained, I consulted with landscaping professionals to address the drainage issues created by repeated soil compression. All materials used are environmentally approved and commonly utilized in modern water management systems. Nothing in the HOA covenant restricts appropriate drainage solutions on private property. The room remained silent as I methodically presented my case. When I finished, several hands went up around the room. Tom Henderson was the first to speak. "I think many of us have experienced similar situations," he stated, looking directly at Barbara. "Last year, I was fined daily for a small garden fountain until I removed it. The following month, Ms. Winters installed an almost identical feature in her own yard without consequences." His statement opened the floodgates. One by one, residents stood to share their experiences with inconsistent rule enforcement, selective violations, and intimidation tactics. Mrs. Rodriguez described receiving weekly notices about her unapproved flowers, while Barbara built an unauthorized patio extension. Mr. Chen detailed how his request for solar panels was repeatedly denied, while board members received immediate approval for similar installations. Robert Blackwell listened to these accounts with growing concern, occasionally glancing at Barbara, whose expression had transformed from righteous indignation to defensive anger. When the resident testimonies concluded, Robert cleared his throat. In light of these concerns, I believe we need to review our violation notice procedures and enforcement practices. I propose forming a committee to audit all violation notices issued in the past year and establish more transparent processes moving forward. Barbara immediately objected. This is completely unnecessary. One disgruntled resident creates a hazardous situation, and suddenly you are questioning our entire operational system. Her protest was met with murmurs of disagreement from around the room. Robert, perhaps sensing the shifting community sentiment, called for a vote on the audit proposal. It passed overwhelmingly, with only Barbara and one other board member opposing. As the meeting concluded, many residents approached me, some offering quiet thanks, others sharing contact information for future HOA reform discussions. The community had been awakened from its passive acceptance of arbitrary rule enforcement. Walking home in the evening darkness, I reflected on how quickly power structures can shift when people find the courage to speak up. My lawn would require some restoration work, but the modified drainage system had served its purpose beyond my expectations, not just in delivering consequences for trespassing, but in catalyzing a long-overdue conversation about fairness and accountability in our community. The week following the emergency HOA meeting brought substantial changes to Oak Ridge Estates. The newly formed audit committee began reviewing violation notices immediately, discovering patterns of selective enforcement that could no longer be denied. Robert Blackwell, perhaps attempting to salvage his own reputation, embraced the reform movement with surprising enthusiasm, implementing a new requirement that all violation notices be verified by at least 2 board members before issuance. Barbara was notably absent from community functions. Her SUV, thoroughly cleaned after its adventure in my specialized drainage system, remained parked strictly in her driveway or on the street. 10 days after the incident, a for sale sign appeared in front of her home. The neighborhood grapevine reported that she had accepted a position on an HOA board in a development 30 miles away. I dedicated a Saturday to restoring my front lawn, returning the modified sections to standard drainage conditions. The work was peaceful, almost meditative, as I removed the specialized compounds and replaced them with regular soil and fresh sod. Several neighbors stopped by throughout the day, offering help or simply checking on progress. "Shame to remove such an effective system," Tom commented with a grin as he handed me a cold drink. It was quite the community service. I smiled in return. The demonstration served its purpose. Sometimes natural consequences are the most effective teachers. The following month brought the quarterly HOA meeting, now held in the fully renovated community center. Attendance remained high, with engaged residents participating actively in discussions about community improvements. The audit committee presented its findings, revealing that over 70% of violation notices in the previous year had been issued to just 8 households, none of which included board members or their friends. New procedures were voted into place, including a resident appeal system and rotating violation verification teams. Robert Blackwell announced his intention to step down as president at the end of his term, supporting a more collaborative leadership approach for the future. As spring progressed into summer, a remarkable transformation occurred in our community. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now greeted each other warmly. Small improvements appeared in front yards as residents felt safe to express their individuality within reasonable guidelines. The atmosphere of fear had been replaced by one of mutual respect and cooperation. One pleasant Sunday evening, I placed a comfortable chair on my front lawn, something I would never have considered doing in the previous climate of scrutiny and judgment. Sitting there with a book and a glass of lemonade, I admired my restored grass, now lush and unmarked by tire tracks. Mrs. Rodriguez walked by with her small dog, pausing at my property line. "Your lawn looks beautiful again," she observed, though I must admit I rather enjoyed its previous, special qualities. We shared a knowing smile before she continued her walk. As the setting sun cast golden light across Oak Ridge Estates, I reflected on the curious path that had led to this moment. My conflict with Barbara had never been merely about grass or parking. It had been about boundaries, respect, and the courage to stand up for what was right, even when conventional methods failed. Sometimes the most effective solutions come not from confrontation or escalation, but from creative applications of natural principles. Water always finds its level, and communities, like lawns, thrive best when everyone respects proper boundaries.